Hi everyone. I realise I'm staring into a bright light, which is a bit kind of daunting actually, and also quite disconcerting. I'm going to talk today really about my practice and where I've started. And what I noticed today is really today has been about film and soundtracks for film. And that isn't something that I essentially do. It was something I have actually made one soundtrack, so I thought that might be a good way to start. And being here in Brighton reminds me of the first time that I one of the first sound pieces I made was actually called Brighton Rocks, and I came down to Brighton and secretly stole quite a few pebbles to take to an installation in Holland, which was in a shipping container, and I recorded the sounds of the typical sounds of Brighton, the sea, the pier, and it was also a smell installation, so I also had the smell of chip fat. And people in Holland were fascinated by this because apparently they didn't have piers, and it was quite a different cultural experience for them. So people got very excited about Brighton in Groningen in Holland because they're quite they're landlocked. And it reminds me of being there and recently going back onto the pier and listening to the sounds, and they've completely changed. Things like Shiver Me Timbers no longer was resonating off the pier, and it could become a bit more digital and more commercial, and the sound, it'd always been commercial obviously, but the sounds had changed. So doing sort of sound installations for me started back in about 1999. Originally I was making music, and I was one of those people I didn't actually like before performing or standing in front of people, which is kind of what drew me to radio and sound, to be the person behind the scenes rather than in front of them. So it's something I've had to learn to live with, and being a lecturer, obviously, having to stand in front of people is something I have to do on a day-to-day basis. So one of the first projects that I did was back in 2000 when I worked to make this only soundtrack that I've done, which is for Hong Kong Airport. And I've always wanted, every project I've done has been an experiment where I've been kind of pushing my own boundaries with sound, or my understanding of what sound is, or what a sound installation can be. And for this particular project, I worked for, it was quite a commercial project. I was working for Norman Foster, who'd basically built Hong Kong Airport and wanted a film to sort of showcase the airport. And I thought for me that was a great opportunity to sort of say to them, well, can I do an Ambisonic installation? Can I make the soundtrack but have it as a 16-speaker Ambisonic installation? So they said yes, which is great. I'd only made my shipping container installation before that, so I didn't have a track record of working in sound in that way, but they were up for it. So they sent me off to Hong Kong, and I recorded basically for 10 days. I was at the airport with my Ambisonic mic, and I got a guy called Tom Wallace to come and help me. And it was before Ambisonic mics were really small and portable, so I had to bring a full-size studio one and push it around in a shopping trolley around the airport to record the sounds. And they were very kind to us. In China, first of all, they were like, oh, we're not sure if you're allowed to record. And in the end, they let me record on, standing on the runway, which was unbelievable, sort of, with my shopping trolley in a cart on the middle of a runway, recording the airplanes as they took off. So I got some quite amazing recordings from the airport. But when we went to Hong Kong Airport, we kind of had a romantic idea of what it would be like. But obviously, most of you, I've imagined, have been in a Foster building, and they are actually quite sterile places. And the sound itself isn't that exciting. It's actually very, very quiet. So they're very quiet acoustic spaces. So one of the things that I thought about when we were there was, how are we going to make this, how are we going to make this work? The main sound that we could hear in the airport was actually the sound of plastic carrier bags. They were the sound that resonated the most throughout the airport. So a film was being produced at the same time. Because we're experimenting, we're young sound artists, thought this is a way of trying something different. We didn't shoot the sound in real time. It was all done in post-production. So the film was shot in the same week, but we didn't record the sound at the same time. So in fact, the whole thing was a complete sort of fabrication of basically gluing together different sounds and making them into a narrative, which is the narrative of the film for the airport. And I'm sure most of you that work in sound design do this all the time. But for me, it was an interesting experience. and one that made me think, well, actually, this is fun, but it took, it took several months to put together. And at the end of the day, I can show you a clip of it because obviously this was for a 360-degree screen. So the screen was curved, and the screen was about the size of this stage, actually. And you'd walk into the space, and then you'd have the 16 speakers around you, proper ambisonic mix with sweep as well. And obviously, I'm not going to play you now. It's just basically a stereo mix that is of it, so it's all the sounds completely crushed. But just to get an idea of what the sound was like and how, and sort of the illusion of everyday sounds in the airport was achieved. So I'll just play you a clip. It's only 1 minute 56. There you go.
We will soon arrive at Hong Kong International Airport, where Terminal 1 is to the left.
So that gives you a taste of it. Obviously, it doesn't sound anything like it did. It was the idea was it was immersive and that you were in the space and you felt that you were actually in the airport. Obviously, it's a bit of contrivance because, as I mentioned, the sounds were quite much quieter, and we had to sort of bring it all together in that way. And the piece was shown in the British Museum in the Sainsbury's Centre, and it went to Denmark and a few other countries as part of a kind of tour to show the Foster Studios' work. So it was really great that they embraced sound and took that on as a project. So, and I think that there is a synergy between architects who have got an outward reach to think about working with sound designers, and that was something, this was back in 2000, which I was certainly able to benefit from, and it was a great experience. I worked in Paul Gilleran's studio in London, in Brixton, where he's got a full ambisonic setup, and we used, with the 16-speaker setup that came from Sheffield, from the, I think it was originally the music, there was a music, it was the Contemporary Music Museum in Sheffield that had an ambisonic setup that he ended up buying off them when it closed. So if you ever need to do any work in that area, I recommend that studio. And obviously it was all done in Pro Tools, and you can hear there's lots of plugins, etc. So it was a great professional project and something I really enjoyed doing. However, for me, I'm always looking for the next thing. So I was ready to sort of move, after doing that project, I sort of plunged my head further into radio because that was my true passion. So I'm just going to jump out here and go back to the PowerPoints, if you bear with me 1 second. So I've just finished a PhD that I've been doing for many years at LCC, at the University of the Arts London. And for that project, I wanted to bring together my passion of radio and surround. And to begin with, originally when I was going to do my PhD, I was actually going to do a surround piece for radio. But as I researched and got more into the subject, and the more I found out about conceptual radio art, the more I actually wanted to break away from doing things in a very polished, clean way, and actually wanted to embrace the ideas rather than the sound. So that's kind of taken me on an interesting journey. So one of the first pieces I made for the PhD, which is basically a project called Switch Off, where I was looking at what would be on the radio after it had been abandoned. So this idea that FM in a few years may not be used. In Norway, for instance, next year, they're going to start, they're actually stopping analogue radio and switching off, having digital switch off for radio, and they're going to be broadcasting just on DAB. So I was imagining, well, what does that mean in the UK? And what does it mean for an artist? And who's going to be squatting the airways after they've been abandoned? So the project that I've been doing for the last few years has been imagining different futures for FM spectrum and making them into sound installations, which I've been showing mostly in galleries, and sometimes I've been doing them as actions in unusual spaces. So one of the first installations was called Radio Mind, and each of my sound pieces really draws into the history of radio and the history of radio art. So I did a lot of research into the first 100 years of radio art, and I wanted my radio artworks to reflect that. And I also, my understanding of what radio art is that it's works that are medium specific. You're making radio about radio, so it's not just a sound piece being aired on the radio, it's about radio. So this particular work was really, for me, drawing into the history of radio. I wanted to bring together the people who thought about radio in the 20s. And I was particularly interested in a spiritualist in 1920 called Archbishop de Vernet, who'd basically been writing about how radio could be a form of telepathic communication. And I was also interested in a man called David Burliuk, who was a Ukrainian futurist who'd also saw that radio style was a new kind of art form and was something that could also reach out to artists across the world. So I kind of wanted to draw on their ideas, but I wanted to make a spoof religious radio station that was current, that drew into the past, but also played with these notions of what people thought about radio. So I wanted to make an installation that basically allowed me to draw on those themes, but I also wanted to make a radio sound installation that didn't just use headphones, because I'd been to lots of installations where people just had speakers or they just had headphones when they were showing their work. And I wanted to move away from that, so I wanted to use radios as my speakers. And so all my works have been specifically made to be aired through radios in a specific space. So, this particular work was aired at the Deep Wireless Festival in Toronto, and it was also shown at the Lightworks Festival as well as in the Old Lookout. So I'm going to play you a short film now, which was made by Ben Rowley, of me in the space when it was in the Old Lookout. It gives you an idea of the piece. It was an hour-long radio piece heard through multiple radios in the ceiling, which were little black birds. You can see on this PowerPoint here some of the black birds. Each of those is an FM radio, and with one central radio at the front, a sort of mock 20s radio that's actually broadcasting on FM. So the whole piece is being aired on FM through transmitters, FM transmitters. It was broadcasting on a specific frequency. I think it was 102 FM. And people would go into the space to engage with it. And if they had FM radios with them, or they tuned in on their phone, they could also listen in that way. So this is the first piece, so I'll let you take a listen to it. Obviously, when you heard it, you'd hear it through multiple radios. So again, you're hearing it in a more condensed form here. So if I could just hand over to the techie then, if you could just play that first film, that'd be brilliant.
Sharing past and future lives, giving you time to find peace through the radio. Hold out your hands and feel the vibrations. We are not alone. You want it more now? Everything is yours when you share your radio mind. Reach out and touch me, for I am the true one you have been waiting for. Throw away your empty mind and sail to pastures new on these mystical vibrations. The radio has not been colonized. It is yours if you want it. Turn off your radio. Turn off your radio. Turn off your radio. Ah, but you are still here. You want to know more. You want to understand why I'm talking to you, why I understand your despair, your dissolution.
The law of psychic harmony pervades our whole religion.
Radio mind, feel the waves of abandon guided to the lighthouse in your mind. Radio mind will anchor your thoughts.
Vibrating energy of God reaches its climax in the harmony of active love. I understand the transformative possibilities of telepathy, this radio mind, for human communication and divine healing. Perhaps this is the greatest contribution I have to make to the cause of science.
We are found, we are here, you are here. It is the way. Share your joy, lose your doubts, embrace this moment.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what the piece sounded like. And you can hear it's made of, it's a montage of many different people talking. None of them were actors. They were just people I thought who sounded like the characters I wanted them to be. For instance, the Scottish voice that you heard there, he's actually a poet, but he fitted the space, because when I first made the piece, it was site-specific to that location that you saw there. And I wanted to also talk about the history of the location as well as the radio links. I also drew upon the, in Bristol there was an event that happened, a friend of mine was running, called the Full Moon Orchestra, and he'd invite improvisers to meet together to play music, and anyone could come along and conduct them. So I went along and conducted them to make the Radio Mind chart, which I used in the piece. So I was kind of drawing on lots of different people to make that piece. I played some of the music myself, and I also worked with a guy called James Backhouse, who's known as Xylitol, and used some of his outtakes and messed about with them and put them into this piece as well. So I kind of had a complete artistic vision of it, but I was able to draw different material into it. I also I've got a Wasp synthesizer, which I also used in it, and I was kind of sort of channeling sort of Delia, Derbyshire and things like that into the work. But it was very playful, very rough and ready, and the idea was it to be heard just through small radios, those small little radio birds, not for a big system like this. So this gives you a very different... I imagine some of you are sitting there having heart attacks about the sound. So for me, it was more about sort of DIY, this idea that you could set up your own surround system in a space. So this was when I started thinking about, I wanted to make works a bit more surround using the radios, how I could use different frequencies to make surround pieces using radio. So I'll just jump through these. So one of the next pieces that I made was called Commercial Radio, and this was shown with two other pieces. Was shown with two other pieces in the gallery, which was Lone Broadcast and Numbers, which I'll talk about in a moment. And Commercial Break for me was this idea of what was going to be left on the ether. This idea of that there will be discarded advertising floating around on FM that had just been left by one of these kind of tiny commercial stations that's just run by a robot and just accidentally kind of is just still broadcasting, but it's all kind of smashed up. And I have to say, I've never been a massive fan of commercial radio, so it was kind of my revenge to make this piece called Commercial Break. And I actually used an advert for digital radio and completely sort of plunderphonicked it, cut it up and glitched out, And then I ended up having it aired on DAB radio because there was a broadcast happening which I got involved with, which was broadcasting across the whole of Kent, which was called Boat Radio. So it allowed me to broadcast Radio Mind and Commercial Break every hour for a week. And it was quite interesting because I was using sounds you wouldn't hear on DAB at the time, glitching, static, all the things we love about radio and are sort of excited about in this piece. So I'll play you a little bit of it.
Lockdown of the road and digital radio, digital in-car radio, and indulge yourself in the digital radio.
Okay, for time reasons I won't play you the whole piece, but that gives you an idea of it. And so really, in a way, the poster that I had made for the exhibition kind of highlights what I wanted to do with the sound there. And it was, you know, I just cut every little piece into, cut them into tiny like slithers and put the piece back together that way. Then another piece that I worked on was called Babble Station, where you can see I was using solar panel radios here, and I invited people to bring their toddlers to come and babble, because you never hear babies on the radio. It's kind of the last thing people want to hear on the radio, or perhaps they're not allowed. You don't often hear children on the radio unless it's their own radio station. So I loved the musicality in the pre-speech utterances. And at that time, I had a young toddler myself, so I enjoyed listening to the musicality of his voice. And I wanted to bring that into the piece. So in this piece, it's basically a sort of invisible nursery of children babbling away. And the idea was basically that in the future, that the FM frequency would just be used for baby monitors. So that's where that idea came from. I won't play you it, but I think you'll get an idea of what it sounded like. This was done with 4 different transmitters, so different babies coming out of different speakers. So it was when I started experimenting with surround for radio. And then the next piece, which I thought was very successful in terms of actually achieving a nice mix of surround mix with radios, was a piece called Numbers. And it's interesting with the last speaker, they both talked about the Occupy movement. And this piece was called Numbers, and it was actually inspired by the Occupy movement and also by number stations, which were the early radio stations that have been broadcasting since the Cold War, which broadcast numbers in a kind of encrypted code. No one knows really who's sending them or why, but it's obviously something to do with espionage. So I kind of was drawing on the history of radio being used for espionage, being used for covert reasons. And I wanted to bring together what was happening now with the Occupy movement. And so I made this piece called Numbers, where I created this encrypted code, and then I took tweets from the Occupy movement and changed them into numbers, and then broadcast them on radios in the gallery. So I had sort of 12 different radios, 3 transmitters, playing different people. So as you walk through that space, you'd hear different people coming out of different radios doing the piece. And it sounded a bit like a sound poem in the way. And there was a performance in the gallery where they took they sort of improvise with the sounds, and because they also enjoy the musicality of the piece. So I'll just play you a little clip of that to give you an idea. And I asked people to, when they came to the gallery, to also submit their own code using the code so that I could make them into future broadcasts. And in the future, I'd quite like to automate this so that it can just be a web crawler can pick up the messages and just broadcast them for me. And so that's something I'd like to do in the future. And this was at the Sidney Cooper Gallery, and it was also in Illinois in America. So I'll just play a little bit.
2, 82,
82,
3,
83,
83,
6,
82,
83,
2,
82,
83,
3,
79,
82,
79,
2,
3,
82,
79,
3,
75,
2,
79,
2, 72,
6,
75,
2,
86,
75,
2,
2,
82, 6,
4, 3,
2,
6,
75,
3,
88,
6,
75,
84,
3,
88,
5,
4,
75, 5, 72,
84,
5,
86,
4,
3,
74, 5, 4.
So you get the idea. But obviously, you don't hear any of the surroundness in here, so it's which is a shame. But basically, you can imagine different people coming out of different radios, and it worked really well. So I was quite pleased with that. Then I did. I mentioned I also did some actions as well as doing installations, and this was a live action from a gallery called the V22 in London, where they had an artist station just broadcasting for over the summer. And so I used it as a chance to test out software that people use to jam with each other, because I was really interested in network interactions that had been happening in Germany and in the last 10 years, where many radio stations joined together and were able to do live radio programs, 24-hour live broadcasts using, with thousands of people involved. So I thought, well, if you're just one person, how could you bring together people to jam with radios and use radios as a musical instrument? And how good would the sound be if you had no budget and you weren't using your own server, you just wanted to use what was available today? And it was quite interesting to do research into this to find out it was actually quite limited, and you could really only have 5 people jamming at once in good quality. So it was an experiment for me that I wanted to test, and I got people to get involved, and people could keep changing seats, and we jammed together for 2 hours. And it was, it was really good fun, but it also sounded quite amazing. So I've used some of the sounds from this action for other pieces. But just to let you know, that was one of the radio actions that I did. I did another action which was on a train, and I was broadcast. Basically, I plugged in an FM transmitter and broadcast the soundscape on the train from Canterbury to London. And it was a kind of reverse action of a man called Max Neuhaus, who's a sound artist who'd done a really interesting piece in the 60s called Drive-Through Radio, where he basically put up transmitters along a road, and to hear the piece, you'd have to drive through in your car to pick up the radio broadcast to hear the sound installation. So I was kind of doing the reverse. I was using the train as a way of broadcasting for 17 miles as it went through the space, and anyone who happened to randomly tune into the piece by accident would hear it. So it's quite a playful action. And I also, and there's another piece that's up here, which is Lone Broadcast, which was a installation imagining that the FM was going to be just used for shipping distress, which that's not going to ever be the case, but there is a possibility if you look into the way in which radio works, that could happen. So that was more of again, a radiophonic piece that was actually looking at how thinking about making works that were quite reminiscent to early radiophonic workshop. And I haven't brought the clip for that, so I sadly can't play that, and I don't think I'll have time. So I'll put it up on my website. Another piece that I made recently was for a museum called the Beaney Museum, and it started off in the Lookout, where I asked people to donate radios, and I got people to donate me about 70 radios, mostly FM, which was good because I was only broadcasting through FM, and you can see in the picture there's a mix of radios there, a couple of AM ones too. And so I had 70 radios broadcasting my work as well as with this piece called Radio Recall, where I'd ask people to share their memories of radio. So I went to the Lookout and asked people to come along and talk to me about radio. So people of all ages gave me their input, and I'd record their stories, and then I cut them together and used AM frequency sounds to put together this sound piece. And James Backhouse also helped me with the AM sounds as well. So I'll play you a little clip.
You want to know about the glass accumulators for early radios. Well, I would imagine it would be in the 1940s. That would be my job, to collect the glass accumulators, which had to be recharged weekly at an electrical shop. 6-volt they were, and they lasted, powering the radio, about a week. The really posh ones had ours didn't, but the really posh, expensive ones had an arrow to show you how much it was discharging. They were the real posh ones. But the whole street, I had a carrier bike, and that was my Saturday job. I'd say about 5 people wanted their accumulator changed. They had a spare, you see.
You only had power through an accumulator. You had to go to the shop and have it refilled. Yeah, it was like a little glass telephone box type thing, about 9 inches, I suppose, high, and square, about 3 inches square round it, and you had to have it filled up with some sort of liquid. It was like paraffin or petrol or something like that. I don't know what it was, but you had to take it to the shop and have it topped up and stuff like that, and then you could play this radio. It was brilliant.
The other memory I have of that is quite frequently, it seemed, we had to cycle into Ballybay with an acid battery, quite a heavy thing with a handle, glass. It was probably about 4 inches square and about 8 or 10 inches deep, with a handle, black handle, and carry that into can't remember where it was, somewhere in Ballybay, have it recharged and cycle home with a new one, connected up with two leads, I think. And there may even have been two of those batteries. And
Okay, I'll stop it there. But it gives you an idea of how it sounds. And it was all recorded in a workshop where I asked people to come and help record. Some people have never done any recording before. It was in a space that was near the sea, so you're hearing seagulls and sounds that added into the mix. And sometimes it was a little bit muddy, but mostly, we managed to get the best bits to put into the work. And that piece was sort of half an hour piece that's rotated in the gallery and I also had another 4 radio pieces that I'd commissioned to go in that piece to be aired through the radios as well. Then the work that I was doing, the most recent work I've been doing has kind of actually taken me under the casing of radio in some ways, because I was running workshops making FM transmitters and FM receivers and AM receivers. And so I got really excited about what I could do with them. And so I first of all learned about how Tetsuo Kagawa, who's a Japanese artist, made copper plate transmitters. And then I started using the breadboard techniques that I learned from making receivers into making transmitters. And so I came up with basically a schema for this particular transmitter, which I put onto a book because I wanted to broadcast the whole of Spiritual Radio, which is the book that then influenced me to make Radio Mind, one of the first pieces that I played you. And I like this idea. There was a commission basically looking for people to reimagine a book, and I'd had this idea already, so I was looking for the right place to do it because I realised I'd need a budget. And so this commission allowed me to basically get the book bound, printed with the text. The text was obviously from the 1920s, and then get an actor to record the whole book with additional sound from myself and Jim Backhouse, and then the piece was made as an installation and broadcast on FM in the gallery just from the book. So that's a picture there of the book. And it's been exhibited quite recently at the International Sound exhibition in the Morley Gallery in London. And so this project kind of really excited me because I stopped thinking just about radios as found objects. So all the pieces that you've seen earlier, I was airing things through radio. Now I'm using radio as transmitters. So basically, radios are picking up the works, but I'm making transmitters to air the works, which has been quite exciting actually, and has led to me making my next project, which is Tree Radio, which is what I've been making this summer, and is up at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and I had a residency up there, and I wanted to take the idea further and actually record. I wanted the tree to broadcast its own sounds. So I wanted to make a sound installation which allowed me to basically broadcast the sound's reaction to light and water within the tree. So I worked together with Anthony Elliott, and I made the transmitter, and this is the transmitter that you can see in front of you. And he made some sensors that we put up in the tree, which is in this picture here, so that we could pick up the sounds, all made from very basic technology. And it was inspired by early tree wireless, when the American Army basically had been using radio as antennas, and I wanted to use them as transmitters. And I know my time is up, but can I just play a very, very short film? And I'll just play you a bit of the tree radio, what it sounds like. And you've probably all got a really beautiful idea in your mind of what a tree radio might sound like when it's broadcasting. So hopefully I'm going to shatter that when you actually hear what it sounds like. So it's quite rough and ready, but this film that Phil's going to play you now is what it sounded like when we tested it, and it is working. Okay. So that was when it was being tested, so we don't have a polished film to show you of it, but it worked, and we're very excited that, an idea that it could work. No one's ever tried it before, as far as I've heard. Perhaps someone may be able to tell me that they have, but I've not heard of anyone ever trying this before, that it worked. The only problem was obviously keeping it dry, and it goes against every law of electronics to have something out there on a tree. So now it's been housed in a box, but at least it works. And if you are at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, can you go and test it for me? So I think it's broadcasting on 102 FM. So I've run out of time, so if people have got questions, please feel free to ask me some. Nothing too taxing though, okay?
Any questions? I was just wondering if you've ever encountered the technology or considered using the technology wave field synthesis in your sound installations, if that rings a bell.
I thought about it, but I kind of wanted to get away from that, where people are using sort of, are you talking about Max MSP, that kind of thing, or are you talking about something else?
The speaker array that it generates sounds from behind the speaker array, so no matter where you're standing, the point is specific, so it's an installation.
I think we should talk about this afterwards. Sounds interesting.
One up there in the middle.
Was that notes from the tree? Is that sort of just a kind of the pitch of that note? Is that decided by the tree?
It's decided by the tree. There is a very basic oscillator was built by Anthony, which basically is triggered by the moisture in the tree or the light sensors. So the tree, obviously, when basically it hits those notes based on whatever amount of light it's getting or not. Obviously, those parameters are going to be set by us, so we could make it a little bit slower or faster or higher, but we can't, it's quite basic. So it's in a formative stage at the moment, so it's still something that can be further developed.
Is the interference are at the station?
Yeah, because
picked up by the tree and then we put out, or is that just going on?
well, that was at the very end. You heard interference. So if you walk outside the field, basically, if you're at more than say 200 meters away, then you start getting the interference of other stations. No, that was coming through the FM receiver. But interestingly, I didn't realise when I did the project that it's next to one of the biggest FM towers in the country. It's quite an impressive tower. I was thinking, oh my God, I'm battling with that. But but yeah, it works really well within the it's sort of mini FM is what I'd call it. So it's not an illegal broadcast.
Any last questions? No?
I'll be happy to answer questions at the bar.
Thank you, Magz, so much.